Let me ask you something right out the gate. Have you ever been left without a word? Not with a dramatic goodbye, not with a slammed door, not even a poorly written excuse, but with nothing. Just silence. They were there, and then they weren't. No closure. No warning. Just vanished. If that's ever happened to you, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. That kind of exit doesn't just hurt, it haunts. It lingers like fog in a field you can't escape. And yet, here's the wildest part. So many of us carry the wrong idea about closure. We believe it's something we're supposed to get from the person who walked away. That if we just had one last conversation, one last explanation, maybe we'd feel better. But what if I told you that belief is the very thing keeping you stuck? What if the absence wasn't a punishment, but a turning point? What if the silence wasn't a curse, but a mirror? You see, we've been taught that relationships end with a bang. That someone should explain themselves, offer clarity, maybe even apologize. But in truth, the most devastating exits don't make a sound. And yet, those are the ones that echo the loudest. Why? Because we were never prepared for that kind of ending. It violates our expectation of what love should look like, even when it's leaving. And in that unexpected vacuum, our minds spin, spiral, and break. But here's where this message flips everything. What if your healing didn't have to depend on their return? What if your strength didn't have to be proven in pain, but in peace? What if the pain you're feeling right now isn't weakness? It's the exact pressure needed to reveal your next version. Because today, we're not just exploring the wound. We're naming it, understanding it, and then transforming it. I'm not here to coddle you. I'm here to hand you the sword of clarity and ask, are you ready to stop chasing ghosts and start reclaiming your worth? Are you ready to see the truth behind the silence and choose a path that honors your peace, your power, and your progress? Because if you are, if you're brave enough to sit with what hurt you and not let it harden you, then this isn't just another video. This is a moment that could change everything. And what comes next? Oh, it's the part that makes you want to stay. Because in the next 7 steps, we're going to break down why this silent exit hurts more than any final goodbye, and how, through stoicism, through reflection, through stillness, you'll not only rise from it, but you'll rise stronger than you've ever been. Let's begin. 1. The absence that speaks louder than words. Imagine you're standing in an empty room long after someone walked out, and you're still waiting for a sound that will never come. That silence, it isn't passive. It echoes, resonates, fills every corner of your mind with unanswered questions. You expected a goodbye, some sort of closure, maybe even an argument you could grapple with. Instead, you got nothing. No final conversation. No apology, just an exit that left a vacuum. In that vacuum, your mind runs wild. Was I ever that important? Did our time even matter? What did I do wrong? You replay every detail, every text, every moment as though you're searching for a missing piece, hoping to reconstruct the ending that never came. This kind of exit doesn't simply annoy you, it unsettles you. Unsettles your sense of reality. You begin to doubt your memory, to suspect the connection you thought existed was a figment you conjured. And while a loud argument or a dramatic breakup can wound, at least you understand what happened. At least you can trace cause and effect. A silent exit is a riddle without an answer. It leaves your mind spinning, replaying scenes, awaiting closure that never comes. It doesn't just end a chapter, it suspends the entire story in limbo. In Stoicism, we learn to expect adversity, not emotional shortcuts. And yet, nothing in your Stoic training prepared you for this silence. You were trained to confront pain, to bear losses with acceptance, to find strength in stillness. But this silence is insidious. It cloaks itself in nothingness and still manages to rupture your peace. Yet how can you find peace if you're still waiting for someone who disappeared? How do you root yourself when you're anchored to absence? That's the paradox of the silent exit. You can't move on, because you're stuck in the quiet they left behind. And the more you wait, the more space they occupy, psychologically, emotionally, energetically. This is why, when someone exits without acknowledgement, their absence speaks louder than any words ever could. Because their silence forces you to fill the void with your own pain. We've discussed before how closure isn't given, it's created. But here, before creation can begin, first you must name the wound. You must acknowledge that no goodbye is still a departure. A silent exit is a deliberate choice, by them, not a random oversight. And recognizing that separation isn't mistake. It's decision, that's the moment clarity begins. You start to see, they didn't vanish because they couldn't explain, they vanished because they didn't want to be held accountable. They left you with questions because they didn't have the courage for answers. So yes, that kind of silence hurts more than any final goodbye precisely because it is still a decision, a coward's decision to disappear instead of clash, avoid instead of confront. But what if, just for a moment, you shifted from reacting to reflecting? What if you tested each doubt, each worry they left behind against the light of your own worth? What if you asked yourself, am I really diminished because they disappeared? Or is my value inherent, independent of their presence? In Stoic relationships, we don't seek validation from others. We derive our strength from within. Silence may have been their final statement, but that statement says more about them than it ever did about you. It reveals their inability to face discomfort, their fear of accountability, their immaturity in handling emotional responsibility. It says, I could not meet your reality, so I erased mine instead. And your pain? Your anguish? That isn't a measure of your failure, it's evidence of your investment. It shows you care deeply. That's not weakness. That's clarity. And in that clarity is power. You begin to see that silence doesn't invalidate your experience. If anything, it confirms it. It confirms that they were here, they just lacked the resolve to stay. You begin to hold both their absence and your value simultaneously. Not erasing one in favor of the other, but allowing yourself to exist beyond the void they left. This process isn't easy, it isn't instant. But it begins with one disciplined choice. Choose not to let their silence own space in your thought life longer than it deserves. In Stoicism, we manage impressions. We decide what's in our control. Their silence is outside your control, but your response to it is entirely yours. You can resist becoming tangled in their unspoken drama. You can refuse to let an uncommunicated exit rewrite your narrative. So here's the crux. Silence doesn't close the door, it leaves it ajar, hoping you'll return to fix it. But in Stoicism, you learn to lock the door yourself. Not as revenge, but as protection. Saying, I will not await a phantom apology. I will not wander in the maze of what-ifs that never ends. I surrender the illusion that they owe me anything. That surrender feels heavy, but paradoxically it's the weight that roots you in peace. When you release the expectation, you self-liberate. And once liberated, you start the true process of closure, one built not on their unreliability, but on your unshakable self-respect. Then silence stops being a weapon they hold over you. It becomes quiet space you inhabit, rebuild, reclaim. If their silence echoes, that's on them. You instead choose to fill your own silence with purpose, stoic reflection. Gratitude for what you learned, resolve to meet the next moment fully present. In that, something shifts. Their absence stops hurting so much. And that's the first deep step of this journey. 2. When silence makes you question reality. You ever find yourself staring at your phone, reading old messages like they might suddenly update with answers? Like somehow, buried between a good night and a thinking of you, there might be a clue explaining why they disappeared. It's wild how the human mind works, how it fills in gaps when no one else provides closure. That's the cost of a silent exit. It hands your imagination the reins and watches it run circles around your peace. And here's what makes it worse: when they vanish without a word. They don't just leave you in confusion, they leave you with a mental labyrinth where every corner is a version of, was it me? And every hallway echoes, "What if I had just?" And you walk it again and again because you think deep down, there must be a reason, some logic, some flaw, something you missed. But what if there isn't? What if the silence isn't about your shortcomings, but their cowardice? What if this feeling of uncertainty has nothing to do with your value and everything to do with their fear of showing up as someone accountable? Think about it. Were you really asking for too much? Or were they offering too little and hoping you wouldn't notice? Stoicism teaches us to investigate our impressions, to observe our thoughts rather than get caught in their storm. And in Stoic relationships, that reflection becomes crucial when someone exits without explanation. Because what they leave behind isn't just absence, it's the residue of their avoidance. You might even start doubting if the relationship was real. You ask yourself, did I imagine the connection? Was I projecting? But stop. Ask this instead. Why would someone who was fully present now act like you never existed? Not because you imagined it, but because some people are emotionally present only when it's easy. The moment it gets real, when presence demands consistency, effort, truth, they shrink. They ghost. Not because you were unlovable, but because your presence required depth they never developed. That's the heart of it. You weren't abandoned because you were too much. You were abandoned because you were real. And real is terrifying for people used to wearing masks. Have you considered that their silence might actually be a form of emotional collapse? A retreat from being seen too clearly? Stoicism doesn't chase people. It observes them. It accepts them. But it never confuses silence with wisdom. Silence can be peace, yes. But it can also be evasion. And evasion leaves wreckage in its wake. Here's the tragedy: they walked out without warning. But you're the one cleaning up the emotional debris. And what are you left with? A mess they caused, unanswered questions, and a tendency to blame yourself. That's the injustice of it. But blaming yourself won't make them come back. And even if they did, it wouldn't give you the validation you deserve. Because their departure wasn't about you. It was about the mirror you held up. A mirror that showed them their emotional immaturity, their inconsistency, their inability to love without control. They didn't just leave, they ran from their reflection. But here's a shift I want you to consider. What if that silence is an unintentional gift? What if it forced you to finally see your own worth, independent of their recognition? What if, in the stillness, you heard your own voice louder than ever? And what if that voice wasn't asking, "Why did they leave?" But instead, "Why was I waiting so long for someone who wouldn't even stay for a conversation?" That's the kind of question that breaks illusions. That wakes you up. Because when you finally stop interpreting their absence as a statement about your value, you start redefining what you allow to remain in your space. You stop chasing. You start choosing. You stop asking for closure. You start closing the door yourself. And that is the beginning of healing. Real healing. Not the kind where you hope they notice. Not the kind where you post cryptic captions or play games to get their attention. But the kind where you wake up one morning and their name no longer holds power in your chest. That's Stoicism in practice. Peace through clarity. Healing through decision. Strength through presence. Because peace isn't found in their explanation. It's found in your refusal to wait for it. Some people leave because they never intended to stay. And some people stay only long enough to take. What you experienced may have felt mutual, but it wasn't. It was your presence, your effort, your emotional labor holding the whole thing together. That's why their silence hurts so deeply. It reveals how alone you really were the whole time. But now you're awake. Now you can see clearly. And what you see is this: people don't ghost because you were too intense. They ghost because you required consistency, accountability, honesty, and they weren't ready for any of that. They wanted love without growth, connection without challenge, intimacy without exposure. But you, stoic that you are, you weren't built for shallow. You were built for real. And real scares people who have never dealt with their own truth. So instead of rising to meet you, they retreat. And silence becomes their shield. But that shield doesn't protect them from themselves. It only delays the consequences. And those consequences, those will visit them in the quiet hours. You might never hear the apology. You might never get the truth. But silence carries its own weight. And they will carry it alone. So, while they run from themselves, you run toward yourself. You sit in the silence not as a victim, but as a witness. A witness to your own awakening. A witness to your strength. That's the quiet revolution of Stoicism. That's the depth of Stoic relationships. We don't collapse under the weight of absence, we rise from it. And that rise doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't need to be seen. It just needs to be true. Because there is power in not reaching out. In not replying. In not filling in their blanks. You don't need to play detective. You don't need to decode mixed signals or spiritualize someone else's inconsistency. You just need to accept. They left. And in that acceptance you are free. Not because you got the answers, but because you stopped needing them. That's maturity. That's Stoicism. That's real growth. And now, instead of holding space for the person who disappeared, you hold space for yourself. Your silence becomes sacred. Your peace becomes your loudest reply. And when the pain hits again, and it will, remember this, you don't need to keep the door open for someone who snuck out the back. You don't need to be the bigger person when that just means being the person who gets hurt. You only need to remember who the hell you are. Someone who gave. Someone who stayed. Someone who tried. Someone who deserved a goodbye. But you didn't get it. And that's okay. Because now you don't chase echoes. You become the voice. And that voice, it speaks with clarity, with courage, with calm. You didn't imagine it. You weren't too much. You were just enough for someone who didn't have the capacity to hold it. And now it's time to stop spiraling around what they didn't give and start standing firm in what you still hold: dignity, depth, direction. Because their exit wasn't your ending, it was your emancipation. And if you've made it this far in the video, if your heart is nodding even as your chest aches, I want you to honor this moment. Type number 1 in the comments if this truth is yours. Like this video if you're ready to stop shrinking for people who walk away quietly. And subscribe right now, because this isn't just the end of the hurt. It's the start of your healing. And I promise, what's coming next will rebuild more than it ever broke. 3. The illusion of peace in their departure. It's easy to believe that the quiet ones, the ones who walk away without shouting, without slamming doors or starting a war, must be more mature. That somehow, their exit was more dignified. That silence equals peace. But let's confront that lie right now, because Stoicism doesn't mistake stillness for virtue. Stillness must come with intention. And leaving quietly, without ownership, without honesty, without even a whisper of truth, that's not grace. That's avoidance. That's fear wearing a mask of calm. See, in a Stoic relationship, silence must have meaning. It must come after clarity, after presence, not in place of it. So when someone disappears quietly, while you're still invested, still present, still hoping, they're not offering peace. They're abandoning accountability. They're walking away from the responsibility of being known. Because to be known is to be seen. And to be seen is to be held responsible. Most people aren't ready for that. So they choose an exit that looks elegant from afar, but is built on emotional cowardice. They ghost, they vanish. They fall off the map and expect you to fill in the blanks. And the worst part? Society rewards that. It calls them emotionally mature, low drama, protecting their peace. But no. Let's name it correctly. That is emotional immaturity wrapped in performative detachment. It is a desperate act to keep themselves from having to face the discomfort of conflict, of consequence, of the mirror you became. Because you didn't just love them, you revealed them. You didn't just support them, you reflected parts of themselves they hadn't reconciled. And so, to protect their illusion of self, they had to erase you. But they couldn't do it loudly, because that would risk exposure. So they chose the path of least resistance, the silent exit. But let me ask you, does silence feel like peace to the one left behind? Does it feel noble when someone leaves you with no warning, no honesty, just absence? Or does it feel like betrayal dressed in stillness? The truth is, silence doesn't always mean serenity. Sometimes it means suppression. Suppressed emotions, suppressed truths, suppressed responsibilities. And when someone suppresses their need to speak truthfully, what they leave behind is not peace, it's confusion, guilt, blame, and a haunting sense of incompletion. And in your effort to find meaning, you end up carrying the emotional weight they refuse to hold. You do the heavy lifting. You do the emotional work. You build the narrative. Not because you want to, but because their silence forces you to. That is not a kind exit. That is an abdication of responsibility. And you, if you're not careful, will find yourself justifying their silence by labeling it graceful. But let me remind you, real grace is not the absence of conflict, it's the presence of truth. It's the ability to look someone in the eyes and say, "I can't stay, and here's why." That takes courage. That takes character. That takes stoic strength. Silence, when used as an escape route, is none of those things. It's avoidance cloaked in ease. It's the easy way out. It's choosing personal comfort over mutual closure. So if you're here, hurting over someone who left without a word, don't fall for the illusion that their exit was enlightened. Enlightenment is transparent. Enlightenment is accountable. What you experienced was not wisdom, it was withdrawal. Withdrawal from growth. Withdrawal from reality. Withdrawal from a love that asked more of them than they were prepared to give. And that's where it gets real, because their silence wasn't about you at all. It was about their threshold. You became the edge of their emotional capacity. And instead of expanding, instead of leaning in, instead of rising, they ran. And silence was their shield. And in that silence, you were left to process emotions that belonged to both of you. But here's where Stoicism shifts the lens. We don't seek fairness from those who lack integrity. We seek clarity from ourselves. So ask yourself, were they ever truly at peace? Or were they just pretending? Were they ever truly connected? Or did you simply carry the depth while they floated on the surface? Were they ever really in this with you? Or were they performing affection without internalizing responsibility? The answers aren't easy, but they are freeing. Because the moment you see that their peace was never real, you stop envying their absence. You stop missing their silence. You stop idealizing their departure. And instead, you begin to feel something unexpected, relief. Relief that you no longer have to carry a relationship that was half real, half imagined. Relief that you're no longer tethered to someone who saw your love as something to escape rather than honor. And most of all, relief that their silence no longer controls your story. Because in Stoicism, we take back our narrative. We reclaim our peace not through confrontation, but through discernment. We don't demand apologies, we stop expecting them. We don't wish for returns, we welcome the space their absence created. And that space, though painful, becomes sacred. In that space, you begin to rebuild, not from the story they didn't finish, but from the one you choose to write now. A story where your voice matters, where your presence is no longer minimized, where your emotional generosity is met with emotional maturity. That's the transformation this pain is offering. And yes, it hurts. Yes, it's unfair. But in that hurt is your evolution. In that silence is your invitation to finally choose yourself without needing their permission. And in that choosing, you become whole, not because they came back to validate your worth, but because you stopped needing them to. That is the true illusion that breaks here. That someone else must complete what they abandoned. No. You complete it by walking away from needing anything more from them. That's Stoicism. That's growth. That's your power. And as that power grows, their silence begins to lose its weight. It no longer stings, it simply reveals. And what it reveals is that you were never really safe with them. Not because they didn't care in moments, but because they lacked the consistency to care when it counted. And care without consistency is confusion. Love without effort is longing. Connection without commitment is a cage. So when they left, you were not just freed from their presence, you were freed from a pattern. From the invisible labor of trying to keep something alive that was already fading. From the quiet hurt of waiting for words they would never say. And now that you've seen the illusion, you don't fall for it again. You don't call silence peace unless it's rooted in truth. You don't interpret disappearance as maturity. You don't mistake stillness for clarity. Because you now know. Silence can be a sanctuary, yes, but only when it follows honesty. Only when it honors both people. Anything else is just an echo of unspoken pain. And you, my friend, are done echoing pain. You are done explaining silence. You are done filling in the blanks. You are now living a life where communication is clear, where intentions are honest. Where exits are explained, not because you demand it, but because you embody it. Because you now set a new standard. You've graduated. You've awakened. And that awakening didn't come from their words. It came from their absence. It came from your strength. And that strength, it's only growing. 4. You were not left because you were weak, but because you were strong. They didn't walk away because you were unworthy, they walked away because your presence asked for truth, and they weren't ready to be honest. They disappeared not because you were too much, but because you were too real, too grounded, too emotionally clear in a world full of people still clinging to their illusions. See, when you bring that kind of presence into someone's life, the kind that sees through their masks, that invites accountability, that holds space for something genuine, you also expose everything they're still hiding from. And not everyone can survive that kind of light. Not everyone is ready to sit with a version of themselves that feels small in the reflection of your clarity. So what do? They run. Not always physically at first. Often, it begins quietly. The tone changes. Response is slow. The warmth dulls. The laughter feels slightly forced. And while you're still showing up whole, they're already fading. Not because you failed, but because their survival depends on staying unseen. And you? You saw too much. You saw their patterns, their wounds. You understood them on a level that made them feel naked. That kind of intimacy is terrifying for someone who hasn't built their identity on truth. So rather than rise to meet your openness, they escaped. They chose the path that allowed them to avoid the work, to avoid the reflection, to avoid the depth you offered. And they did it by disappearing. But let's be clear. This is not a reflection of your lack. This is a reflection of your strength. Because it takes strength to ask for real connection. It takes courage to expect consistency, honesty, emotional presence. That's what Stoicism reminds us, that asking for truth is not a flaw. It's a filter. And what it filtered here was someone who was never ready to be held accountable. Think about that. Not everyone can read the language of a rare book. And when they open your pages, expecting illustrations and surface-level highlights, and instead find poetry, wisdom, depth, they close it. Not because the book is broken, but because they can't comprehend the content. You were not too deep. They were too shallow. And yet you probably blamed yourself, didn't you? Told yourself you should have been easier, quieter, simpler to love. That maybe your expectations were the problem. But stop. Breathe. Rethink that entirely. Why should love mean shrinking? Why should connection require dimming your light? It shouldn't. Not in Stoic relationships. Not in any meaningful relationship. And the fact that they vanished the moment you started showing your full spectrum? That tells you all you need to know. They weren't looking for a partner. They were looking for a mirror that only reflected the image they wanted to see. And the moment you started reflecting back their truth, they panicked. That panic wasn't about you. It was about what you triggered. Growth. And not everyone wants to grow. Some just want comfort, familiarity, control. And when your presence disrupted that, when your voice asked for honesty, clarity, emotional depth, they recoiled. You challenged their narrative. You became a reality check. And that, for someone unprepared to evolve, is too much to bear. So they exited quietly, hoping you'd question yourself, hoping you'd shrink. But you won't. Not anymore. Because you now understand the truth their silence tried to bury. That your love wasn't too much, it was precise. That your presence wasn't overwhelming, it was awakening. That your need for honesty wasn't a demand, it was a standard. And what they couldn't meet wasn't a reflection of your height, but of their unwillingness to rise. So where does that leave you? It leaves you stronger, wiser, sharper. Because now, you don't chase people who vanish. You don't decode exits that were never meant to be explained. You simply observe, accept, detach. That's stoicism in motion. That's emotional maturity. And from here, you no longer internalize someone's inability to stay as a reason to doubt your worth. You recognize it for what it is, a mismatch of depth, of readiness, of soul. And in that recognition, you start to breathe easier. You reclaim your space. You feel the silence not as an ache, but as an opening. A chance to fill your life with people who understand your language. Who don't just flip through your pages, but read with presence. Who don't shrink when you show up whole. Who match your effort. Who answer your honesty with clarity. That's the real win. That's the evolution. And yes, it may come later than you wanted. But it arrives exactly when you're ready to stop settling for silence and start standing in truth. You are not bitter. You are not broken. You are simply done shrinking. You are done doubting. You are done making excuses for people who lack the maturity to walk with you. And in that resolve you find peace. Not the kind they pretend to have in their quiet exits, but the kind built on wholeness, on integrity, on self-respect. You now know who you are. And more importantly, you now know who isn't ready for who you are. That's a gift. That's freedom. And if you've been nodding along, feeling this truth echo in your chest, then this moment is yours. Type number 1 in the comments if this part of the message hit home for you. Like this video if you've ever blamed yourself for someone else's emotional exit. And subscribe if you're ready to never shrink again. Because what's coming next? It's not about what they left. It's about what you're now ready to claim. 5. Closure is not given. It's created. There's a belief we hold on to tightly when someone disappears from our life without warning. We think that if we could just talk to them one more time, just hear them say something that wraps everything in a neat little explanation, the pain would stop. We imagine that if they just send a message admitting fault, or offer a glimpse of honesty, our hearts could finally exhale. But let's bring that belief into the light, because what if it's not true? What if the closure you're waiting for isn't coming? What if the silence they left you in is all they're capable of? Stoicism doesn't teach us to beg life to explain its outcomes. It teaches us to understand what's within our control and what isn't. And waiting on someone else to deliver our healing, that isn't within our control. So what happens when we finally realize that? What happens when the fantasy of one last conversation begins to dissolve and the truth of their silence becomes undeniable? It stings, yes, because it's final in a way we didn't choose. But it's also freeing, because it means we can stop holding space for a moment that was never promised. Think about this. How much of your energy has been spent refreshing pages, rereading texts, wondering if they might come back, not to rekindle, but just to explain? How much of your peace has been suspended in emotional limbo because they left and didn't bother to close the door behind them? That's the cruelest part of a silent exit. It leaves you with not only the loss, but the weight of unfinished meaning. But here's where Stoicism offers a powerful shift. Closure isn't a gift they give, It's a boundary you decide. It's not something you're handed, it's something you step into. And once you do, you no longer have to depend on someone else's emotional maturity to feel whole again. You begin to realize that peace doesn't wait for someone to circle back. Peace is built the moment you decide their silence no longer deserves space in your thoughts. That moment isn't flashy. It's quiet. But it's revolutionary. It's the morning you stop checking your messages before you even brush your teeth. It's the moment you stop scanning crowds for their face. It's the breath you take when you catch yourself spiraling and say, "No, not today." It's the sacred decision to stop watering a garden they walked out of. And it starts with this truth. They knew what they were doing. They knew they left you with questions. They knew their silence would linger. But they still chose to walk out without clarity, without communication, without care. And if that's what they chose, what makes you believe their return would bring anything more? Because even if they came back, even if they offered you every word you wanted, would it change who they are? Would it change the fact that they were willing to disappear instead of confront? Would it erase the nights you stayed awake trying to find meaning in their absence? No. And the hardest part about creating your own closure is accepting that truth. It's sitting with the realization that their absence says everything their presence never did. And what it says is this: you deserved more. You deserved a goodbye. You deserved a conversation. You deserved someone who didn't flinch at emotional responsibility. And because they couldn't give you that, you now give it to yourself. You become the one who ends the chapter. Not them. You. You write the final sentence not with rage, not with resentment, but with resolve. You say, "This is where it ends, not because they told me, but because I decided." That is self-respect. That is inner authority. That is Stoicism applied in its highest form, choosing peace over understanding. Choosing dignity over desperation, choosing to move forward without needing anyone to hold your hand through it. And maybe they'll never apologize. Maybe they'll pretend it never happened. Maybe they'll post as if they didn't leave you holding the weight of something you didn't break. But that doesn't matter anymore. Because now, their silence doesn't hurt the same. No. It's just a reminder of what you survived. And more importantly, what you will no longer tolerate. The moment you create closure is the moment you stop craving explanation. You stop waiting for someone to acknowledge your pain. You stop hoping that the same person who hurt you will also be the one to heal you. You stop telling the story from their point of view and start telling it from yours. You say, "Yes, they left. And yes, it hurt. But no, I won't let that be the last word." You rebuild. You reclaim. You redefine. And in that act, you do something powerful. You take back your voice. The one that got buried under confusion. The one that whispered, "What did I do wrong?" The one that doubted its worth because someone else couldn't face their own. You dust that voice off. You sharpen it with truth. You clothe it in dignity. And then you let it speak. Not to them, but to yourself. You say, "I am enough." Not because they said it, but because you believe it. And here's the transformation most people don't expect: when you stop needing closure from them, their silence stops echoing. It fades. It loses power. Because the only reason it ever held power was because you gave it meaning. But now, you are the one assigning meaning. And what does it mean now? It means you saw the truth. You didn't look away. You stood in the discomfort of uncertainty and chose to create clarity. That makes you powerful. That makes you free. And the most beautiful part: no one can take that from you. Not even them. So while they move on pretending it never mattered, you move on with integrity. While they hide from their reflection, you face yours head on. While they use silence to avoid, you use silence to rebuild. And yes, there will be days when it still stings. When you wonder what it would have been like if they had just stayed and talked. But on those days, remind yourself of this: their words wouldn't change the truth. Their presence wouldn't fix the pattern. Their explanation wouldn't erase your clarity. Because now, you don't need closure. You are closure. That's the power of choosing yourself. That's the essence of Stoic relationships. Not waiting for someone else to validate your ending, but being bold enough to create it. That's what you've done. And that's what you'll carry forward from this moment on. 6. The power of walking away without looking back. There comes a moment when you stop needing to be understood by the person who vanished, and instead you begin to understand yourself with a depth that no explanation from them could ever provide. That moment is quiet. It doesn't happen with a speech or a dramatic declaration. It happens when you wake up and feel different. It happens when you scroll past their name without your breath catching. When you remember them without spiraling. When you stop imagining their return as something that could heal you. That's when you know you've crossed the invisible threshold. That's when you've taken back the power that silence tried to steal. See, they expected something different from you. They expected the chase, the pleading, the endless analysis of their exit. But you didn't give them that. You gave them distance. You gave them space. You gave them silence, not because you were afraid, but because you were finished. And that kind of silence? That haunts. Not the loud kind, not the reactive kind, but the kind that is grounded in truth. The kind that says, I don't need to convince you of anything anymore. That's the essence of Stoicism, not suppression, but sovereignty. And sovereignty means you no longer abandon yourself to make sense of someone else's absence. You no longer rewrite your story to fit their unwillingness to stay. Because now you know that love doesn't require vanishing acts. That real connection doesn't need to hide behind disappearing. That peace doesn't perform. And walking away, not with bitterness, not with rage, but with poise and purpose, is your final act of reclaiming your life. It's not cold. It's clear. And that clarity doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. So why does it sting so much to leave quietly? Because deep down, you wanted it to end differently. You hoped they'd rise. That they'd turn around. That they'd match your truth with their own. But they didn't. And they won't. Because if they were capable of that, they would have never left without a word in the first place. And now that you see that, your silence becomes not just a response, it becomes a statement. Not a performance, not a punishment, but a mirror. One they must face every time they think of you. Because while they disappeared to avoid the weight of truth, you stayed to carry the weight of your healing. And now that healing has grown legs. It walks with you. It breathes with you. It shapes how you show up, not with walls, but with discernment. Because you no longer give your heart to people who fear depth. You no longer explain your standards to people who don't honor their own. You no longer wait at the door of someone who exited through the back. You simply walk. And that walking? That's your closure. That's your declaration. That's your transformation. In Stoic relationships, departure isn't about erasure, it's about emergence. You don't leave to disappear, you leave to become. And you don't need to make noise when you do, because your energy speaks. Your absence speaks. Your refusal to engage with crumbs when you deserve the whole feast speaks. And eventually, they will hear it. Maybe not with their ears, but with their conscience. With their memory. With the echo of everything you were that they couldn't hold. And they'll remember. Not because you reminded them, but because you didn't. Because your silence gave them nothing to fight, nothing to argue, nothing to spin. It just gave them a mirror. And mirrors don't lie. So when you leave, leave fully. Not with one foot in the memory and the other in hope. Not holding space for their possible return. Leave with your whole being. Leave without leaving breadcrumbs. Without posting quotes meant for them. Without testing their reaction. Leave in full integrity. Because that is what they never expected. They expected the drama. They expected the breakdown. They expected to be chased. And when you didn't give them that, you forced them to meet the emptiness they left. And that emptiness? It won't be filled by distractions. Or the next person. or silence. Because eventually, everyone must sit with what they ran from. And you? You don't run anymore. You rest. You build. You rise. Not with noise, but with stillness. Because now you know your worth. Not because someone told you, but because you decided to stop settling for being treated like an option. You chose to become the answer. And when you walk with that kind of truth, you don't lose people, you shed them. You shed those who cannot meet you where you are, who cannot match your honesty, who cannot withstand your depth. And shedding is not loss, it's refinement. You become lighter, clearer, sharper. And what remains? That's what matters. That's who matters. But most importantly, you matter. And not in some surface-level affirmation, but in the deep, unwavering knowing that you are no longer waiting for someone to make you feel chosen. Because you choose yourself. You choose your peace. You choose your values. You choose your boundaries. And you hold that standard, not out of pride, but out of love. Love for the person you are becoming. Love for the truth you now refuse to compromise. Love for the future you're building with hands that no longer reach backward. So if you've made it here, still reading, still breathing, still rising, let me speak directly to your soul. You are not too much. You never were. You are just enough for the right kind of love. The love that doesn't leave. The love that doesn't shrink. The love that doesn't hide. The kind of love that begins with you and ends in a life built on truth. That's what you're moving toward. That's what's next. And if you felt any of this in your bones, if this part of the journey struck you where you needed it most, then show yourself that you're ready to move forward. Like this video right now. Type, number 1, in the comments if this truth belongs to you, and subscribe so we can continue walking this road of clarity, healing, and strength together. Because this isn't just the end of a story, it's the beginning of your becoming. So here you are, at the end of it all, sitting in the quiet, not because someone handed you peace, but because you chose it. Not because the silence stopped hurting, but because you stopped giving it permission to define you. You've walked through every room that pain tried to lock you in. You stood in the echo of their absence. You stared at the door they left open, and you made the boldest decision anyone can make in a world full of noise. You decided to close it yourself. That's no small act. That's not a weakness masked as control. That's strength in its rarest form, unassisted, unprovoked, and completely internal. There was no applause, no validation. Just the soft knowing that you couldn't stay in the limbo their silence created. So you stepped out. And as you did, you carried with you not just the scar of what they didn't say, but the wisdom of what you no longer need to hear. You stopped asking them to finish the chapter, and you picked up the pen instead. Not because you had all the answers, but because you finally realized the answers weren't coming, and they never had to. That's what Stoicism teaches us, that certainty is a luxury, not a necessity. That peace isn't found in closure from others, but in clarity within ourselves. So now you walk not as someone broken by silence, but someone shaped by it. You understand now that people don't disappear because you're forgettable. They disappear because they weren't ready for what stayed. Because showing up consistently requires far more strength than showing up passionately. And you? You didn't show up to impress. You showed up to build. You offered something real. And real exposes everything that's artificial. So if they left, it wasn't because you failed, it's because they couldn't keep performing. And maybe for a while, you confused their absence with your lack. Maybe for a while, you wondered if you were hard to love. But no, you were only hard to manipulate, hard to lie to, hard to keep on the surface. And for people who live shallow, depth feels like drowning. So they swam back to comfort while you stayed and learned how to breathe. Now that you know this, you stop blaming yourself. You stop revisiting conversations that never happened. You stop asking questions designed to stay unanswered. Instead, you sit with the echo and listen to your own voice again. You hear your truth, unfiltered. And in that truth, you find a new rhythm, a new way of moving, not in reaction to others, but in alignment with your own core. You no longer live to be understood by people who lack the capacity to understand. You no longer carry the weight of justifying your presence to those who disappeared. You live lighter now. Not because you forget, but because you release. You remember who you are. Not in fragments, not in comparison to who left, but in the full expression of your becoming. That's the real victory, not getting them back, but getting yourself back. And this version of you, the one who doesn't chase closure, the one who doesn't beg for understanding, the one who stopped needing to be chosen to feel complete, this is the version that silence never expected to meet. Because silence thought it would break you. It didn't. It refined you. It stripped away every illusion, every dependency, every soft hope that someone else's presence was required for your healing. And now, that healing is yours. It doesn't wear their name. It doesn't wait for their apology. It just breathes. It expands. It unfolds in every decision you make from here on out. And as it unfolds, you begin to see the patterns. You begin to see that the ones who left without a word were never really anchored in you. They were anchored in the version of themselves you made them feel safe enough to be. But when that version required work, required truth, required evolution, they left. And you didn't. You stayed. You evolved. You rose. You did the work. And because you did, you no longer repeat the old patterns. You no longer open your heart to people who speak loudly but vanish quietly. You no longer confuse affection with intention. You no longer interpret mixed signals as mystery. You now see clearly. And what you see is simple. The people who matter show up, consistently. The people who love you will choose to stay through the hard parts. Not just when it's convenient. Not just when it's fun. But when presence becomes a practice, not a performance. And that's the only kind of connection you now accept. Not because you're bitter, but because you're wise. Because Stoicism has taught you that emotion is not weakness, it's a compass. That feeling deeply is not something to suppress, but something to channel. And now your emotional depth is no longer a place where others get lost, it's a space where you are found. Found by yourself. Found by those who are ready. Found by a life that doesn't shake when someone else disappears. That is your power. That is your legacy. That is your peace. And it was born not from a happy ending, but from a silent exit that hurt more than any goodbye ever could. Because it didn't just end a relationship, it began your becoming.